This is Trepp Wire with a special guest podcast. I'm Haley Keene with Trepp, a data, modeling, and analytics firm for the CMBS, commercial real estate, and CLO markets. I'm with Manus Clancy, Senior Managing Director, and Lonnie Hendry, Head of CRE and Advisory Services. Today, we are joined by Ethan Penner, considered by many to be the creator of the CMBS market and the modern commercial real estate finance market in the 1990s. Since then, Mr. Penner has become somewhat of a Renaissance man, blogging frequently with his thoughts on life, teaching at Pepperdine University, and now he is an author. On October 31st, Ethan will be releasing his book, Greatness is a Choice, which can be pre-ordered now on Amazon. We're looking forward to spending time today talking about the new book, lessons that may be applied to finding greatness professionally, all while tying it back to lessons for the commercial real estate industry. For those that are fairly new to the commercial real estate market, Ethan is regarded as a pioneer who reshaped the real estate finance industry in the 1990s. His innovations revived a struggling commercial real estate market by bringing much-needed liquidity. Real Estate Finance magazine named Ethan one of the U.S. real estate industry's 10 most important leaders in the 1990s. He was also voted the Financial Services Executive of the Year for 5 consecutive years and was included in the Global Finance magazine list of the world's most powerful people. In 2011, the Real Estate Forum voted him one of the industry's 65 living legends. That is quite a resume. Thank you for joining us today, Ethan.
Great to be with you, Haley. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Before we talk about commercial real estate and let Manus and Lonnie take over, tell us about your book and what made you decide to write it.
Well, there's so much to talk about. I'll be brief. The idea to write a book had been in me for a very long time. As a father, with a desire to kind of pass on my ideas to my children, but ultimately for them to have something physical to hand, hopefully to their children, and generationally beyond that. And I just thought every father ought to do that. You know, every father has a life lived and lessons learned, and I don't know, it's forgotten over time. I wished that my father or my grandfather or my great-grandfather had done that for me. It would have been a treasure that I would have just adored, and it would have been my number one keepsake if it existed. And so I thought I might as well do that. And so I had that idea in my head for a long time. It was about 10 days before Christmas of 2020, so COVID Christmas. And I was having breakfast with my daughter, who was 17 at the time, and doing a COVID high school senior year, sadly for her. Our Christmas was going to be small, of course, but my wife's brother and his family were coming. What are you going to get them for Christmas, she asked. I really don't like getting adults Christmas presents, and most of whom was coming was adults. There was one kid. And I thought, you know what? I'm going to write them a book, and I'm going to give them a book. And she laughed at me and said, it's 10 days before Christmas. What are you talking about? When are you going to write the book? I said, right now, right here. And so I wrote what I guess I would call a first draft of this book in 4 hours at that breakfast nook. I wanted to print 10 copies. I thought, oh, this will be for family. But the printer only would allow me to print a minimum of 100. So I printed 100 copies, and I gave that out to friends, and the feedback and people I didn't know who I'd meet. And anyhow, the feedback was incredible. And I can tell you, I just got stories that were inspiring to me. That led me to say, maybe I have something here that's more valuable to the world beyond just handing to my kids. And I let it sit for about a year, trying to figure out how to reposition or rewrite that first draft. And I did. Printed another 100 copies of the second version about a year later. It found its way through a friend of mine who had published books, and his agent read it and liked it, gave it to Wiley Publishing House. They liked it and sent me a contract, and here we are. And that became the book.
It's an amazing story. And for listeners out there, the book has intersections with commercial real estate, but it's really a book about life, much more about life than it is about your career. We're going to do the best we can to play the role of Bob Costas interviewer with Ethan and kind of weave this together between your commercial real estate career and the book itself. I think that there's a lot more intersection once you get into the weeds of it. But before we get into the book and some of the highlights of that, tell us about your commercial real estate career, how you found yourself where you were in 1993 and how it all came about.
Manus, you used the word intersection, and I could have called the book something like The Great Intersection, or there's actually a chapter that you're probably aware of called Intersections. And my career is is where I learned the lesson of the value of intersections. I consider myself a finance person, not necessarily a real estate person, although I've earned the right to say I'm a real estate person too. And that's the intersection, right? I had a career that lived at and perhaps helped develop the intersection of real estate and finance in the world. And I started my career in the savings and loan industry after college, learning what a good loan versus a bad loan was, like learning how to underwrite loans. And it was an amazing experience, which was extremely painful at the time. And very few people as old as me and with the experience I have talk about their first year or two out of college. But my God, those were incredibly valuable experiences that distinguished me as I went along my career, because I had the foundation covered. I think that so many people, young people, rush to be successful, right? I think that's part of the technology era. Like everyone sees 20-year-old billionaires and they are in a rush to get to that place. And I see that in young people. And I look back at my career, which was, I guess, meteoric by our generation's standards, but still, I started at the very bottom that you can't start lower than I started in the world of finance. Loan officer trainee at a savings and loan. You can't start lower, right? I was making $1,000 a month. Even by inflation standards, it's embarrassing, but I didn't care. I brought it hard and I learned so much. I didn't even realize how much I was learning until later in life, when I found myself on Wall Street trading mortgage-backed securities. And I had peers who had, because they had much better academic credentials than me, were able to bypass the painful savings and loan experience and go to Harvard Business School or Wharton or some other great place. And instead of spending 2 or 3 years like I did in the savings and loan industry, they were at a wonderful place like Boston or whatever, Stanford, but they didn't have the foundational understanding of this business and what how loans were made, like the rubber meeting the road. Man, I understood that because I lived it. I wouldn't trade my experience for anything in the world. And I guess that would be a message to everybody out there. It's not really where you start. I have a daughter who's in college now, and I feel sad for her and her generation, because even as a freshman or sophomore in college, the pressure that I see them, like, what internships have they lined up? And this, if you don't get this internship by this year, you're off the track. And it's like, are you kidding me? I couldn't have been further off the track, when I started. And somehow I found myself at the top of the heap very soon after that. And I think that it's just a lesson learned for everybody. So I ended up on Wall Street. It's another long story, but I ended up at Drexel when that mattered. And I was a mortgage-backed securities trader. I was the first person at Drexel, and in that first generation of traders to make markets in non-agency mortgage products. So I was a credit specialist my whole life. And then shortly after being at Drexel, I was recruited by Morgan Stanley to build from scratch their entire kind of non-agency mortgage trading and mortgage finance businesses, which became their biggest, most profitable business for the next 20 years. So from there, I created CMBS, but we can talk about that separately. So that was the background.
So I want to paint a picture for people, because a lot of our listeners, I'm sure, history begins with the great financial crisis. A bigger crisis, most of us in the CRE world know, happened in that time when you were starting on that track. And it's funny you should say the track. I think I was a guy who didn't even know there was a track.
Exactly.
I wasn't even on the lowest level of the track. I didn't even think there was a track. But coming out of the late 1980s, this country had seen enormous growth. There was enormous speculation in real estate. People were building offices and retail properties, suburban offices on spec. Banks were making bad loans. Those bad loans became non-performing loans. Those non-performing loans became failed banks. I think we had 1,000 banks fail between 1988 and 1992, give or take 1993. Mm-hmm. That led to a real epidemic of fear. There was no lending at that point in time. There was no CMBS market per se. Assets were selling for 40 and 50 and 60 cents on the dollar. Enormous billions of dollars were held by the FDIC waiting to be sold off out of distress. And the market was really one big clogged artery. And into that steps Ethan Penner. So why don't you take the story from there?
Well, I think you captured it pretty well, Manus, but to give some a little bit of extra, I don't know, color to that moment. I financed Barry Sternlicht when he first started Starwood, and I had left Morgan Stanley to start what was then Magellan Financial that I ran with backing from Cargill. And Barry was buying on actual in-place income apartments in the Southwest at a 13 cap, okay, and nervous, really nervous, feeling as though maybe he's overpaying and maybe he's going to make a terrible mistake. So, people, when you think about someone buying a 13 cap in apartments that are fully occupied and being nervous when they're doing it, it's hard to even imagine the fear that permeated the market at that time. And I think you're 100% right. That was the most incredible dislocation that one can ever imagine. '08 was very scary, systemically very scary, and maybe systemically even more scary because the financial markets had become so internationalized by then and leveraged, whereas in 1991, the system wasn't really in the same vulnerable place that it finds itself now or found itself in '08, '09. But the dislocation for real estate was never as severe in '08, '09 as it was back in the early 90s. So I had this perfect background. I came to Wall Street when Wall Street started making markets in credit, mortgage credit. I was foundational to that. I ran that at Morgan Stanley, so I had one of the more prestigious jobs in mortgage credit in the world in my 20s, and I had the credibility with bond buyers. I had the knowledge, not only the domain expertise, but the relationships with bond buyers and the rating agencies that I think made me the perfect candidate to create the CMBS industry and create liquidity by basically building a bridge between the bond market and the borrower, the real estate borrower, who had lost all access to financing because every single lender that had serviced the industry had retracted from the industry. And there was literally, if you had a 50% loan to value loan that was maturing, you were facing maturity default because you couldn't get a loan at any LTV attachment point. Obviously, '08, '09 was not nearly that bad. So it was pretty incredible. And I mean, I was in my very early 30s at the time, and I think people were amazed that I was fortunate enough to get Nomura to back me, who were the largest financial company in the world. And so I had this huge balance sheet backing me at a time when there was no liquidity. I took the opportunity to really remake the industry in many ways. I think I'm very proud of what I was able to bring, and it still stands to this day. I brought the bond traders' way of doing business to what was a very slow reacting, non-responsive lending community.
Well, let's talk about that Nomura moment for a second, because they had to be as frightened as anybody, right? Everybody was scared in the early 90s, right? People were terrified. Yeah. Nobody wanted to be the first one to dip their toe into the water. How did you go about convincing them that, this was going to work?
Well, it's an incredible story, actually. So I had started this with this Magellan Financial that I had begun having left Morgan Stanley to pursue commercial real estate when Morgan Stanley wouldn't allow me to use their balance sheets. Why I left. And so I left to pursue this opportunity, and I had Cargill backing me. And I started to make loans to borrowers who had no options and then securitize those loans. And I did probably, $300 million of deals, which was large, for an independent small company at that time. And then someone introduced me to someone who ran Nomura West Coast, because I was out on the West Coast. And the guy flipped over what I was doing and thought Nomura was the perfect partner for me. He introduced me to, I don't know if you remember, but Max Chapman, who was a legendary Wall Street figure and who ran Kidder Peabody, was recruited by Nomura, and he was the first non-Japanese person to run any business for Nomura, and he was actually made the first non-Japanese on the parent company board. Max brought with him his lieutenant from Kidder Peabody to run fixed income and be his lieutenant. So this individual who he brought over was a very smart non-Japanese guy, and he loved what I was doing. And he said, well, come build this business here. And we cut a deal, and he gave me an allocation of capital from his fixed income allocation. By the time the Japanese management knew what I was doing, we were the largest lender in the United States, and it was too late to turn back. So how did it happen? I mean, they just didn't know, actually.
That is a great story. I have this image as you're telling the story, you being the only lender out there, having like a Beatles-like persona, that you're running down the street and everybody who needs financing out there is chasing you like you're John Lennon, because they need to get your attention because they know you have a checkbook with cash ready to be deployed. And we're going to talk more about rock and roll later, because you can't talk commercial real estate and Ethan Penner and the 1990s without crossing over into that segment. But I wanted to talk about the book for just a minute. I want to really weave these things together and get your thoughts, because the book is very much about life. It's about work ethic. It's about joy. It's about health. It's about honesty and dedication to your profession, but also dedication to your family and your soul and your body. I'm going to read a quote to you, and I'm going to try to get your response to this. The daily competition for resources to provide for ourselves and our families define most of our waking hours. Some are better at the game than others and produce more, but for everyone, the competition and the associated pressure to provide comes at a price of deadening our souls and challenging our ability to be human. Commercial real estate, it's not beanbag, right? As they talk about politics, people throw their elbows out there. It's a hard business. People pursue success. People pursue money. How do you balance the two in a commercial real estate world? And put another way, if you had a son or daughter going into commercial real estate, what guardrails would you have them put up to kind of not lose their soul?
Well, look, I have had a long career on Wall Street and in real estate, and I've observed a lot. I've experienced a lot myself. And I had this realization, Manus, that life itself, this competition for resources that defines so much of our life, it does challenge us to kind of hold on to our humanness and hold on to our values. I've seen in the journey of life that I've been on too many people who I love and considered, brethren. My connection with them has changed and breached, right? Because we went in different ways. I've always been, I attribute this largely to my mom, who imbued me with kind of this spiritual sense, and the sense of, I don't know, just being aware of the world in a way that's not just about me and what I'm trying to accomplish, and my family. I've always felt when I did deals and when I do deals, it has to be a win-win. Like if a deal comes to me and I feel like I can win, but it's not going to be a win for the other person, I'd rather pass. There's enough things to do in the world that we can all be selective about finding those that are win-wins and finding the win-win place, right? And I think that that's how I've approached life. The very first chapter of my book, and it's there's a reason it's the first chapter, deals with self-esteem. The world is organized to have us lose our sense of self-esteem. We are chasing esteem in the world, like people saying, oh, Ethan, you're a great guy, you invented CMBS. And I used to recoil from that because it's cool that I did it. And it was amazing that I had the opportunity to make the contributions and accomplishments that I had. But I always felt like I'm not that. I'm much more than that. I'm a great guy, and I'm a great father, and I'm a great friend, and I'm a great husband, and all those things that I really feel like I am. And I felt, in a sense, belittled, no matter how big of an accomplishment I might have had in the business world, being known for that. I'm glad you pointed out. So self-esteem, in that first chapter, I say, if you have legitimate self-esteem, then the inevitable challenges you're going to face in life are never going to get you down, because you look at yourself in the mirror, when you shave or wash your face or go to sleep at night, and you say, this is a nice person. I'm proud to be this person. And then everything else is fine. And I think without self-esteem, all the things you chase that are related to external esteem I don't think that ever fills the hole that you have if you don't have self-esteem. And only you know if you have it. You can't fake it to yourself.
Well, I think for people in our industry, there's a constant yin and yang between filling the stomach and filling the soul. And I think a lot of your book tries to talk about both. I think I give you a lot of credit because it isn't just the soul that you talk about. You do talk over and over again that providing for your family is critical. So my follow-up question is this: we are both of the same generation. We both have 5 kids. Do you find that when you talk this way to people that are in their teens or 20s or 30s, they get it? Or is that something that only comes when you lived as long as we have?
Well, before I answer that, you touched on another important chapter that I was tempted to make. That was actually the first chapter in my first version of my book. It's called duality. And this notion of duality, that polar opposites can both be true. It's a very interesting concept, but it is true. And as you point out, I don't think it's a one or the other. Like, I don't think you can say, I'm just going to be concerned about the world around me. You have a responsibility to take care of yourself and your needs. Otherwise, you're a burden on other people. So you need to take care of yourself and your family. And you also need to be mindful of your soul. And are you doing things that are correct? And so now to answer your follow-up question, I'm going to reference another chapter of my book, which I entitled Advice Giving is Senseless. And the reason I said advice giving is senseless is because I realized that what is correct for a 60-year-old brain is not correct for a 25-year-old brain often. You know, what you might feel and how you might act in response to how you feel as a 60-year-old man or a 60-year-old woman is not appropriate necessarily for someone who's 18 or 25 and who needs to bring it super hard, almost without balance, right? I mean, God, I remember myself in my 20s and 30s, I was aware of balance, but I wouldn't say I was balanced, okay? And I think that there's no way to accomplish that kind of career run that we all strive for in our 20s and 30s without forsaking balance and knowing that you're forsaking balance and hoping you can come back to it at some point. I'm in better physical shape now than I was in my 30s.
Well, that's remarkable. I don't even know what to say about that. That is just
it's just going after balance, you know, and not being able to as well when I was kind of in the throes of what needed to be an imbalanced focus on establishing myself in my career.
Well, I don't want to steal the headline or spoil the book, but the foreword is written by Julius Erving, Dr. J, one of my idols. As a guy who grew up on Long Island, I got to see him play when he was in the ABA.
Unbelievable, right?
It was unbelievable. It was just
people that didn't see that, I feel sorry for, that are basketball fans, because as great as Michael Jordan was, and I was privileged also, we were both to see him play in his prime. What Julius did as a net, I don't think nothing I've ever seen compares to that.
He does talk about in the forward about you bringing it. You bring it on the hardwood, even though you were probably giving up 8 or 10 inches and the ability to maybe touch the top of the backboard, that you brought it when you came to the hardwood.
I think it's our responsibility to bring 100% effort. And that's really the title of the book, Greatness is a Choice. It really talks about how being great is something that's available to every single person every single day. And it comes from just bringing 100% effort to whatever it is you're doing to be the best version of yourself. You know, I like to reference hamburgers because I happen to like hamburgers. But when we bite into a hamburger that is truly great, or whatever food you like, I happen to like cheeseburgers. But when you bite into a cheeseburger, for me, that's truly great. And you go like, my God, the person who made this brought it great for me. And it elevates your spirit. I think that when we touch greatness, and it could be just a cheeseburger, or it could be seeing Dr. J playing the Nets, it elevates us and it carries us to bring that to our lives and touch other people. And it's an amazing thing.
So as we've been speaking with Ethan Penner today, who pioneered the CMBS market back in the early 1990s, another question comes up. What happens when a CMBS loan falls apart? In today's market, the CMBS special servicing rate is almost 7%. And so many securitized loans are struggling. It may be a good time to check in with our friends at the Henley Group. the experts in CMBS and CRE CLO loan modifications and restructures. They've been trusted advisors to borrowers facing challenges with their CMBS loans for 15 years, and they've obtained an extraordinary success rate for their clients. So if you're having issues with a securitized loan, they are definitely the team to reach out to. We know Tammy and David Goldfisher well here at Trepp. They're great people, and we are confident they'll give you valuable advice. So visit thehenleygroup.com for more info, or send us an email and we'll connect you with the team.
Yeah, so I'm going to jump in here, Ethan. I appreciate the dialogue with you and Manus. As someone that's a little younger in the space, it's really great to see both of your perspectives of the 90s, the 2000s, the savings and loans crisis, and then the great financial crisis. I guess as we look at today's market, I see some similarities where coming out of the savings and loans, you had the RTC, you had this invention of CMBS. Are there things that you're seeing now with AI or maybe some of these other technologies that are going to make the same type of market disruption or opportunity for someone maybe like you, but in 2023 in a slightly different vein than what you were able to do in the CMBS markets?
I have no doubt, Lonnie, that this dislocation is profound. It's not yet played out in a profound way, but I do think that we're in a very tenuous spot in commercial real estate, in the world of finance, and in the bigger world itself, which I think, one of the things that I've always thought about real estate is that real estate is a derivative of life itself. Like, if you want to be a good real estate investor, well, you have to understand how things are working in the world, right? And then real estate is where it's the physical space. I call it the physical space where life happens. But to be a good investor in that, you have to actually ask yourself, how do people want their life to happen? And where do they want their life to happen? And then you can invest accordingly. So I think the fundamental questions that I've just brought up are very difficult to answer today, right? How do people want to live their life? Where do people want to live their life? What is the job market going to look like? Because obviously that affects so many things. How will technology, which I think is negative, but how will technology influence the white collar? Forget about the blue collar, but the white collar job market. I think it's really highly threatening to it. And I think that office buildings, for example, which have been pounded, in the last few years, probably stand to be pounded further in many markets and in many ways for some of these reasons over quite a long period of time. So it's a fascinating time. I think it's highly opportune. I don't think that it's going to be, and of course it hasn't been yet, this kind of like free-for-all feeding frenzy that the RTC period was, because in the RTC period, that early 90s period, the government decided to close down many, many, many financial institutions and just liquidate their assets, okay? And so that created this kind of like dumping of assets into a market for which there was really very little organized capital to absorb those assets. And as a result, pricing was, like I say, 13 caps for apartments. It gives you an idea of how crazily low pricing moved because of this supply-demand imbalance of capital. In the last, 4 downturns that we've had since then, there's been a lot of organized capital. So that keeps prices to a certain extent higher than they would have otherwise been. And the government kind of, I would say, learned their lesson, which is don't just dump assets into the market as what happened in the early 90s. So we have seen, the opportunistic investment group has been promising opportunities at the kind of beginning of every downturn for the last 20 or 30 years, and pointing to the RTC period as an example. And the investors keep investing money in these funds, and it just never happens. It's kind of like Charlie Brown with the football, just not happening. So there's one thing very different about today's market than all prior downturns. And it has to do with the fact that it's not just a question of mispricing, right? So assets were priced a certain way in a 1 or 1.5% interest rate environment and are naturally priced differently in a 4 to 5% treasury interest rate environment. That's fine. That has happened before. But what's different this time is a broad recognition of questionable viability for too much of real estate. And so, you used to say, okay, well, this building in a 3 cap is now a 6 cap. We could figure that out. But what about downtown LA? There's no income to capitalize, right? So what are those buildings worth? There's a lot of what I'll call viability risk in the real estate market today. And I think that's going to cause a very different downturn than we've seen ever before.
The government intervention, the extend and pretend that we're seeing in today's downturn was not available in the previous downturns. And there's pros and cons to that. To your point, it definitely prevents that dumpster fire type of sales price transaction activity, which, listen, a lot of people got really successful off of those RTC transactions that they bought for 20 cents on the dollar because they could get some capital together when nobody else could. And they were able to buy things considerably below market and then reposition those assets. But your point about the obsolescence, I think, has to be, underscored here. Office, as an example, you just have a huge form of obsolescence in the market. Kind of going back to your book and comments around balance, a lot of people that have been able to work from home through COVID, they get to go to their kids' soccer practice a couple of days a week now because they're not commuting. It's really changed their perspective on how they view work. And I think we're just now starting to see the ramifications of that at scale in the real estate market.
Yeah, I think that it's getting back to something Manus pointed to. It's the intersection of everything, right? I think to be a good real estate person, you need to understand sociological trends. All the human behavior things come into play when trying to figure out. It's why I love real estate. It's one of the number of reasons why I think it's an amazing, amazing business. You need to really pay attention to a lot of things.
Well, I want to bring it back to something we've touched upon a little bit, past crises, but also, the battle between the pocketbook and the soul. And this one will be a tricky one. So towards the end of the book, you talk about the great financial crisis and how many in our industry felt like it was the end of the world. Major banks were failing. People were getting laid off. A lot of people in our realm, people that were bond structurers, bond traders. But I'd really like to get your take on this. Everybody has an opinion on the great financial crisis. Some blame the government. Others blame banks.
Some people blame me.
Some people blame you. Some people blame no-doc mortgages, and others blame, people that were buying houses on spec, expecting them to flip them. When you talk about the balance between, money and soul, and you look back at the great financial crisis, was the great financial crisis a series of unfortunate mistakes, or do you think there was something more nefarious there? Was there just too much greed and too much chasing returns that really led to the outcome that we saw?
I love the question. And it really cuts to one of my most important beliefs. So I think that there's 2 ways to see the world. Okay. I'm sorry to step all the way back to that, and from that, we'll get to that question. But there's 2 ways to see the world, in my opinion. One is you can see it, as most people do, as being a very random world. So things happen. A lot of them are very bad. We cry, we are sad, we are disappointed, we blame bad luck or Putin or Trump or whoever you want to blame, right? And the other way of looking at the world is a world that's perfect. And I don't want to get religious in the sense, but I do see perfection in the world, even suffering, even like when I think about in my life or what I've seen in the world, in the macro world, I see a world that is a world of reactions to stimulus, right? Things are done, and then there's a reaction that I think is fitting. Sometimes the reaction's slow in coming, okay? But yes, I think that 2008, and that's how markets work, that's why there's cycles, and things are self-correcting to a very large extent, right? I'm a student of finance, I'm a student of human behavior, and I don't believe in intervention. I don't really believe in the Fed, or that there should even be a Fed, because the Fed is an intervening entity who gets in the way of the natural cycle, right? So we could talk a lot about that. But so I think that 2008 was the natural explosion that was coming from a gimmicked financial world that was doing things that were wrong, including, as you say, providing credit to borrowers that had no business being on the other side of the trade. They had no business borrowing. Credit should never have been. We had a wrong idea politically, which is that credit should be available to everyone, regardless of their income. It's like, well, you have to actually pay those loans back. And if you don't, you're going to suffer bad consequences. And I think a lot of politicians are not financial or economic experts, and they might have big hearts, but it didn't end well. And many people on Wall Street, driven by the desire to have a big bonus, were part of a system that facilitated that. And I remember, I'll tell you an interesting story. I had taken off. I don't like bull markets. So I was living in Hawaii for about 3 years during the buildup of that bull market, completely out of the market because I just don't like excessive bull markets. Like, they're distorted and uninteresting, and it's a game of musical chairs. Like, I know it's going to end badly, and I don't want to be standing when the music stops and not having a chair, that's how it always ends. So I remember visiting Bear Stearns in 2007, and a friend of mine was head of fixed income there. And he and another friend of mine who worked there were proudly showing me their beautiful new headquarters and their gigantic state-of-the-art fixed income trading floor. And I walked around, and it was incredible to me how many human beings were employed there, and employed in a business that all their employment was dependent upon making loans to unworthy single-family borrowers who were never going to be able to pay them back. So I said to the guy who remains a friend of mine, I said, this is going to end very badly. And I said, I predict that in the next year, there's going to be firms like yours that literally will be gone. And it may very well be your firm. And he literally laughed in my face. Okay. And of course, it turned out I was right, but I knew it because it made no sense. They were doing things, and they were operating with incredible financial leverage in assets that had no value or very little value. And that's how you actually go out of business, which is exactly what happened. So I think that we all as a society had that coming to us, and unfortunately, Manus, we weren't allowed to feel the pain to learn the lesson. Like, if you had a heart attack because you had an unhealthy life, you feel pain, and you go, oh, wow. If you survive the heart attack, you're a little chastened and you learn a lesson, and you say, well, gee, probably I shouldn't eat the fries 7 days a week. I need to cut the fries down to once a week, or the pizza to once a week, or the ice cream to once a week instead of 7 days a week, like we all like. And lesson learned, and we're better for it. We're better for the pain, right? We needed the pain to teach us to be better people. And societally, I feel that's what cycles do. When the pain is not allowed to be felt by the society, then the lessons are not learned. Then we're amping up the wrong-headedness to a much higher level. And I fear we are in that spot today.
You brought up a good point. You talk about the Fed and being not a big fan of interventionism. Perhaps during the course of these 40 minutes, I've given off a feel that this book is very kumbaya and full of meditation. There's a lot that strikes right at my heart of a lot of what's wrong in this country. And I saw in the book, way too many people getting trophies. That was one of the chapters, which I couldn't agree more. There was a part about, you mentioned it before, too many people giving advice. And you mentioned it in the prologue, too many people letting their souls be deadened by the pursuit of things that are material in nature. So for those that I've given the impression that this is way too spiritual and philosophical, there's a lot of really nuts and bolts advice, which I thought it was a great read and an easy read.
Thank you. I would just say this to kind of add to that, since we're talking about the book for one more second. I wrote the book with an understanding, first of all, the kind of people that write these kinds of books are generally professional teachers, speakers, gurus. I'm of the world. I worked from the bottom up, and I started with nothing. And I've walked the walk that everyone who's listening to this podcast will understand. And so my words are from their walk. They're not from kind of some observation from afar. No, it's from inside the walk. And out of respect for everyone who would read my book, the book is an assemblage of small chapters, like 1 to 3 page chapters that stand alone. So, unlike some people who write very big books, my book is meant to basically provoke thinking and individualization, personalizing the idea for the reader rather than feeding them, gobs of Ethan Penner and Ethan Penner ideas and stories. So anyhow, I'm proud of the book as it is, and I think it's written well for today's very busy person.
Yeah, so I have two questions. You've reached the pinnacle of the professional career, very successful, very well known. At this point in life, you're giving back, you've written a book. I know you do some teaching, you do some other things. Is the latter part of your career more fulfilling, where you're actually able to share your insights and experiences than slaying the dragon and doing everything that needed to be done to reach the top of your profession, And then secondly, how's your family's reaction been to the book? I mean, you talked about, at lunch with your daughter and saying you're going to write a book. Has their reaction been everything that you'd hoped or more? And those would be kind of my two final thoughts.
I would say that the second one first. My family is, I think, proud and supportive of the book and, what I've done with my life. And that's, it's important to me. I think that you want the people closest to you who know you the best to actually think well of you. You want to think well of yourself, but if you're going to look for external validation, that the people closest to you are the people who probably can give you the most valuable feedback. So thanks for asking that. And we're a pretty close family. And so I do share all this with them first. As far as the stages of a career, man, I just loved every stage of my career. Even the $12,000 a year job I had out of college, I found a way to have fun. And I think as Manis was talking to you a bit about the rock and roll that I was able to bring to the journey on Wall Street and things I've done, I've always made sure that my work and professional journey was a fun journey because I was always aware that work is where we spend the majority of our waking time. And if that's not fun, then we're not having fun in our life, right? I'm just always aware of that. And so I want to have fun myself. And I want to make sure that everyone around me is also having fun out of respect for the fact that it's their time and their life. So I don't differentiate. I think that I do different things now than I did then. I have a different temperament that's natural for having experienced what I've experienced and lived life. But I'm still passionate about being great at whatever I do. And however that manifests itself, it'll be. I love the book and I love this opportunity to share what I've done with people and lessons I've learned, but I want to go kick butt and I still am really excited about I love dislocations, so this is a great time to go back to work and to express myself in this profession that I've spent most of my life in, and I plan to.
So there may never have been a guy who had more fun than Ethan Penner. Listen to this from the book. He was known as the rock and roll banker. That was a title given to him by the Wall Street Journal. I know that there's more to this list, but in the book, he talks about having invited, among others, Elton John, the Eagles, the Allman Brothers, Crosby, Stills and Nash, Bob Dylan, Stevie Wonder, Stevie Nicks, and Chicago to various showcases, what they were called, when he would invite his clients and fellow bankers to outings in various places around the U.S. These would happen, I guess, annually or semi-annually. So if we could be so bold, is there a rock and roll story you can give us from, you can't have you on a podcast without having some great rock and roll memory, whether it's from CMBS and a showcase or elsewhere, that you say, I'm gonna give them a taste of what my great life was like when I was 32. Well,
let's see. I was on stage with Sting and sang a song with him. That was fun. I had the Allman Brothers play. We rented out Universal Studios in Orlando it was the Mortgage Bankers annual convention. So we decided to have a big party. Any of us who ever been to places like that, man, it's terrible. But let me tell you, when you have the whole place to yourself and there are no lines, it's actually a lot of fun. So it was really a fun night. But we had the Allman Brothers. And after the Allman Brothers played, we decided to do remember the Viper, the car's the Viper? So we had collected business cards from all the attendees at the party. They're all mortgage banking guys. And we're going to give out a Viper. And we had like the big reveal. The Viper came driving through with a professional driver. And so I picked a name out of the hat and the person wasn't there. but we were honor bound to give him a Viper, but there was no excitement about like the winner's there, right? He had left or something. So I said, you know what? I'm going to give away another Viper. I picked another card out of that. And Boyd Fellows, who was one of my right-hand guys, literally almost fainted when he said about the budget, like, oh my God. So that was fun. Probably the best one though is it's in the prologue of the book. And I'll share that story because it's probably my favorite one. And it was the best, most important, which was the first concert that we had in this kind of journey of hosting private parties and concerts. We had Elton John perform for us. And at the time, it was about 500 people in the ballroom of the Boca Raton Hotel. And it was a surprise who the guest would be. No one knew who it would be. And remember, no one had ever done any of this before. So we told everyone it was going to be some big act. We had Elton John had set up in like a private room, a green room, if you will. And his agent, Howard, wanted to meet me, Elton. So he said, Elton wants to meet you. It's your party. So I said, sure. So I went backstage, and I'm about 33 years old at the time. Ethan Penner, meet Elton John, meet Ethan Penner. And we had two sofas set up kind of like an L. And he was at the very corner of one of the sofas, kind of like cuddled up like a cat and visibly nervous, like almost shaking when I was introduced to him. And I said to him, are you okay? You don't look so good. And he said, oh, I'm a little nervous. And I was very surprised to hear Elton John telling me he's nervous. This is 1994, and he had been a legendary star for 25 years already, right? And I said to him, what are you nervous about? And he said, well, I play big venues like Madison Square Garden or whatever, and everybody at these venues buys tickets to see me play. And I know that they're my fans and they like my music. And here, there's 500 people. None of them know I'm here. So I know you like my music, but I don't know if those 500 people are going to like my music. And I said to him, listen, you're Elton John. I'm sure you'll be fine. They're going to love you. But if you could imagine saying that to Elton John, it was just funny, right? And then he went out, and he just was him and his piano, right? We actually had to fly his piano in, which I don't know how much that cost, but it was not insignificant. We flew his piano in. He brought that nervousness, that fear of failure with him to the stage. And he played nonstop for 2.5 hours, just him and a piano. And every single hit you'd ever want to hear, including we were the first people to hear the Lion King music live. No, he had never played that before. Lion King hadn't come out yet. And I'm not kidding when I tell you grown men were in tears. That's how moving that experience was. And I did that whole thing knowing that it's all about marketing and it's about brand building. But what I realized was at the time, everybody in the world of finance would advertise by taking out tombstone ads in the Wall Street Journal. And so when I found out how much tombstone ads cost, I think it was like $100,000 back then for like a quarter of a page. And I realized nobody reads tombstone ads. First of all, most people, my audience I want to reach is 500 people, and I'm paying to reach 500,000 people or more. It's just idiotic to take out a tombstone ad. So I figure I'm going to save all the money that I would have spent on tombstone ads, and I'm going to create a lifetime memory for 500 people that I actually care about and build this permanent bond with them. And I feel like that decision was one of the best decisions I've ever made, as good as a lot of the structured finance ideas that I came up with, because I brought joy to a lot of people and I created bonds with people that are lifetime. And, you went to one, as you said earlier, with your wife, and it's a memory that we'll all never forget, when we shared, and it brings a bond for everyone who's ever been there. And so that Elton John thing was probably the best one.
Well, you're making this grown man cry knowing that there was an Allman Brothers showcase that I was not
well, it wasn't a showcase.
attending.
That was the MBA party. So if you weren't a Boyd banker, you weren't there.
Yeah, that's right. People know, longtime listeners of the podcast know that I probably refer to the Allman Brothers more than any other rock and roll band on this podcast. So a real affinity for that. So Ethan, tell us, if people want to order the book, how do they go about getting it? When does it come out? And give us some details.
Well, the book is actually available on pre-order right now, Amazon and other distribution vehicles. The book's released by the publisher. The release date's October 31st. So if you order it now, you'll get it that day or the next day, hardcover. There'll be an audio version of it. I'm still quibbling with the publisher whether it's going to be me reading it or other professional readers. And I don't have a problem with the professional readers, except for the ones that sound like AI robots. I don't want them reading it. And look, I think every one of your listeners, I'm going to go out on a limb and say, I think they're going to really love my book. You know, I really am proud of what I've created there.
Well, let me echo that. It's a great book. I'm about 75% of the way through it. I think it's terrific. A very easy read, just full of lifetime insights. Really glad I have it, and really glad to have spent the time going through it. And just really grateful to have you on the podcast today, Ethan. It's been a great hour. And we hope the book sells hundreds of thousands, if not millions of copies. And we really look forward to having you back when you write book number 2.
I really look forward to that as well. Thanks, Manis. Thank you, Lonnie and Haley, as well.
Thank you, Ethan. This was an awesome episode. And, our listeners are going to appreciate your insights, your background, your wisdom. And we might need to do that part 2 of this podcast. So we'll try to book you for another one. And with that, we'll close this special podcast. Thank you, Ethan Penner, for joining us today. Join us later this week as we look at what's happened during the week and how it may be impacting you. If you have a question or a comment, send an email to podcast@trepp.com. Until then, visit trepp.com for more info and subscribe to the Trepp Wire podcast with your favorite provider. Thank you for listening, and stay well.
All right.